let's look at the India-China equation. Nearly 1 month into the standoff on the Doklam Plateau, and there's little sign of any imminent de-escalation. Indian diplomats who have dealt with China say that there's nothing new in what the Mandarins in Beijing are doing. In fact, they say that the pinpricks and provocations have increased ever since the two sides began talks on the disputed border at the level of special representative so many years ago. The root of the problem, we are told, is China's ambition. China wants to dominate Asia. China wants to impede the emergence of India. And this is an attempt to undermine India's position. This is what Kanwal Sibal has said, the former foreign secretary, arguing that China's ambitions in Asia cannot countenance a rising India, and therefore it will seek to contain India by undermining its position in the neighborhood. Sibal then goes on to say that the Chinese tactics on the Doklam Plateau are consistent with its refusal to accept any claims that conflict with its own. This can extend even to citing historical precedent, even when such evidence is thin or virtually non-existent. This, of course, is not the first time that the Chinese forces have challenged India's sovereignty along the border. Remember how China challenged India in Chumar in Ladakh, and this happened while President Xi Jinping was in India to meet Prime Minister Narendra Modi. China says this time it is different. But is it really the case, we ask? And why does China continue to prick India? This is how China, in fact, traditionally engages the enemy. Let's understand the way the Chinese operate to make sense of what is going on in Sikkim. China believes that there are no rules when it comes to a war. China adopts multi-pronged approaches to target the enemy country. In 2003, it had adopted a three-pronged warfare concept: psychological, media, and legal. So how does China prick India, and how does it continue to do it repeatedly? China's incursions in Depsang in 2013 happened ahead of then Foreign Minister's Afghanistan visit. The Chumar intrusions of 2014 happened, as we said, while President Xi Jinping met Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Ahmedabad. So what is the message behind these incursions? China will raise border issues at will. That is what it is trying to tell New Delhi. India must not forget the 1962 war. That's something that the Chinese diplomats have said in so many words. So why dispute Doklam is the question now. Part of China's psychological warfare, we understand. This move expends India's diplomatic and military energy. So China is trying to engage India on this front. It also comes at a time when India is edging closer to the US. And to understand this in more detail, we have with us this evening on Gravitas Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur, a distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies, joining us from New Delhi, and Atul Aneja, the China correspondent for The Hindu, with us from Beijing. Good evening to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on Gravitas. Vice Marshal Bahadur, let me ask you first, what do you think is China trying to do here?
It is following a multi-pronged strategy in the sense that it is attacking us by positioning itself on all fronts: media, legal, psychological, and that is the trend that China has had down the centuries, in the sense that it shows that it is peaceful, it has got a strategic culture of offensive defense, and such that when it takes these steps, it has a long-term view. And in this long-term view, it tends to very gradually eat into the vitals of a nation. So it is not only media, but psychologically it affects the thinking process of the masses in general, including of the security forces. So that is the steps that China takes in any conflict that it has. The same thing is happening at Doklam. It had happened earlier at Chumar and Depsang too, where it got extended. This time we have taken a very strong step of not moving out from Doklam, where we went after we were asked by the Bhutanese government. And so we are there now for the long term.
Right. Atul, what prompted the offer to mediate in Kashmir? China, I'm sure, knows that India's position on that has been consistent. Was this just an attempt to add more pressure on New Delhi?
Well, let me just explain the context of how this happened yesterday, because I was present at the briefing when it happened. There's a Pakistani correspondent who raised this question about the OIC meeting in which Kashmir was raised. And he asked the question on whether, given the tensions at the LOC, whether China would like to do something to ease tensions between India and Pakistan. So it was not something so moto which came, it was in response to a question. In response, of course, it's important the way the Chinese played it out, because saying that Kashmir has attracted the international limelight. So the word international was very deliberately used. Also, the firing on the LOC is causing regional instability, so both international and regional. So it was very clear that the Chinese were trying to raise the tempo in a very calibrated way in terms of putting pressure. But I just wanted to give the context in how it happened yesterday. Whether this is part of a larger strategy, it may or may not be. I think a lot will depend on what happens on the ground in Doklam and the way we move forward. I would also like to say that there are Chinese scholars here also who are saying that there are limits to what Chinese can do in terms of raising tensions. There have been articles coming mainly in blogs and WeChat accounts by Chinese scholars saying that really a escalation to the extent of a war with India would not suit Chinese interests, because of India's own fighting capability, which they acknowledge. They do say we will win the war, but it will be at a cost. And second thing is that their own ambitions regarding the Belt and the Road and the Maritime Silk Road, they get diverted and diluted. And therefore, this is a calibration, but I think it is very, very carefully calibrated. And we would see, I don't think that the Chinese would allow it to get out of hand beyond a point.
We hope not. Vice Marshal Bahadur, if you look at the statements that have come from China so far, and the provocative headlines from the Chinese media which say that India should be taught a lesson. India has consistently been saying that this can be resolved diplomatically, and China, it seems, has maintained this aggressive posture. How do you see India's response so far?
India's response has been very diplomatic and mature. Even yesterday, our Foreign Secretary in Singapore in fact indicated a way out, saying that we have been there in such situations earlier, and it's always maturity that has brought the nations out of such problems. So while the Foreign Secretary extended this, if I can use the word, olive branch, the reaction has not been similarly mature from the other side. I think we should maintain our mature and diplomatic posture. That is what will fetch us good dividends in the long run. We have position in Doklam in a military sense, and I do not think, as Atul said, that it would come to a shooting war. It doesn't suit both sides. Certainly not China, and of course not India too. But this time the message is clear that the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force and the Indian government as such is ready. If I may also add that the news reports say that tomorrow the opposition is going to get briefed by the government. That's a very positive step and shows and sends out a message that the government is taking everybody together and the country is one in this standoff. So even if it's a long-term standoff, so be it. It's happened in Somdolung Chu in 1986, where it was almost a year-long standoff, and it took about 5 to 6 years diplomatically to sort this out, to sort that out. So we should have patience, and we have the staying power.
Right. Atul, we've discussed this before on the show. Beijing is infamous in the neighborhood for annexing land along the border. But did India's response in Sikkim take the Chinese by surprise?
I think so. I think so. They did not expect that China would come to their building construction of a road in Dokalam area, which is the disputed territory between the Chinese and the Bhutanese. And the fact of the matter is that the 2007 friendship treaty with Bhutan then kicks in, which very clearly states that either side will come to the assistance of the other to safeguard each other's national security interests. So therefore, the very fact that India moved in and actually stood by that has taken them by surprise. I think that message has gone in very, very clearly. You see, this is also, in a way, if you look at it in a historical sense, it is something so different with what happened in the 50s, for example, when the Chinese actually built a road without we knowing about it in the Aksai Chin area. To me, it's interesting how our country changes, that in this case, we are taking a preemptive step here because of a very, very clear strategic reason that we can't afford to have the Siliguri corridor exposed much more than it already has been. Because if you recall, the Chinese are also building a railway right up to Yadung, which is part of the Chengai-Tibet railway. So, the problem is that is still a narrow channel, and the Chinese probably wanted to widen the shoulder in a way to open another route through the Chumbi Valley, through the Dokala Pass, which is very close to Nathula, just about 15 kilometers from there. So that's where the road was heading towards, and India has prevented that. I would go by saying that the Chinese have been taken by surprise, and it's most probably going to be a long haul, perhaps maybe even a few years, because there is a precedent, as AVM Bahadur had just said, in the Sumdurongchu Valley. So that might be the case. In fact, I also got a sense, especially in yesterday's briefing, that nobody from the Chinese media actually asked a question about this incident. Given the state, how closely controlled the media is, perhaps there was a signal out there that, let this be put in a bit of a deep freeze, or at least not grab as much headlines as it is. We are having the BRICS summit in Xiamen in September. So perhaps to sort of let it simmer but not escalate beyond a point. That's maybe something which is coming out of the Chinese, but it's too early to say. It's only yesterday's briefing that I sense that perhaps there's a shift in tone, though not necessarily in substance right now.
Right. Delhi for sure does not want a public spat. I'm going to request you both to stay with us, and we want to dwell on what the Chinese army looks like at this point. In 1949, this was the People's Liberation Army of China, more than 2 million strong, a foot-slogging infantry-dominated army made up largely of peasants. So literacy levels were low. The army was low-tech because there was only so much technology a peasant soldier could grasp. But the same PLA presents an entirely different picture today. These men are the result of decades of modernization intended to transform it into a leaner fighting force with improved joint operations capability, with greater emphasis on cyberspace, electronic and information warfare. This, in a nutshell, is what President Xi Jinping is attempting to do today, transforming the People's Liberation Army. He's cutting the 2.3 million strong army to just under 1 million. They will be condensed around 84 corps. Their commanders will be major generals or rear admirals. A joint operations command will be set up by 2020. The current 7 military regions will be restructured into 5 theatre commands. The current 4 military departments comprising staff, politics, logistics and armaments are being enlarged to 15. The new wave of reconstruction and restructuring, follows a decision announced in 2015 to downsize the army by 300,000 men. Beijing has also been upgrading, remember, its military hardware as it grows increasingly assertive about its sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. And to that rising military profile in parts of the world, in the Indian Ocean, where recent reports referred to the presence of as many as 13 Chinese naval vessels, including nuclear-powered submarines. Chinese naval ships are also providing anti-piracy patrols off the coast of Somalia. The Chinese have moved Marines to man the naval base in Djibouti on the strategic Horn of Africa. China already has a base in Gwadar on Pakistan's Baloch coast. The question, Atul Aneja, is this then. When they're both engaged in a military standoff, along the northeastern border of India. How do the two armies compare, given what China has been attempting to do?
Well, you have yourself mentioned that it is the Chinese are becoming a more technologically intensive force, and the emphasis on the land forces is decreasing, and there's a greater emphasis on the Navy and also at the Air Force. Along with that is the command and control structure, which is changing, and the focus seems to be on joint operations. So it is a transition which the Chinese are undergoing in as swift as a way as possible as President Xi would want. So that's going to happen. It is also very likely that as China's trade and economic profile grows global, it is natural that its navy and its military profile will also grow. So this is something which we have to keep into account as we make sure that we have a credible deterrent vis-a-vis China, and as well as our own capacities and niches to make sure that our vital interests, especially in the Indian Ocean, are maintained. I think India is on course towards that, though there is still asymmetry between the two. You can, in terms of the quality of weaponry, India's excess, which has gone now beyond the Russian weaponry, which we used to have, with more good indigenous quality, but more than that, the American hardware coming in and also the Israelis coming in. So, I mean, if it comes to quality, I think India has effectively has its effective, let's say, deterrent vis-a-vis China. The point is that both these countries are aspirational countries, and at this time, their own bilateral relationship is showing great stress. Shiv Shankar Menon had an interview in The Hindu where he said that, the time has come for a better strategic dialogue between the two. What the two have been talking about was framed basically after Rajiv Gandhi's visit in 1988. The time has come to talk together because the bandwidth and the scope of interests of both these countries has expanded. And to prevent any kind of collision from happening, the first thing is to go ahead and talk and expand the strategic dialogue and include more areas of the world. Now, whether that's going to work, that's not going to work. It'll probably be a combination of several instruments of power. But I think that kind of a dialogue, a mature dialogue between these aspirational countries is vital at this time, because this relationship is showing quite a lot of stress. And what we're having in the border is part of that stress, which might now go ahead in other theaters as well. Maybe it may acquire naval dimension in the future. It's possible. So the time for a broader and a bigger and a more deeper strategic dialogue with China, I think, is essential.
It's interesting you talk about dialogue, because first in Hamburg and then again in New Delhi, the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that there was a discussion between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi on a quote-unquote wide range of issues. They did not specify what exactly. The Chinese Foreign Ministry at the same time has denied this report. So interesting times, as you said, the relationship under strain. Air Vice Marshal Bahadur, coming back to the army, India has very, very recently cut red tape to allow the army to procure weapons, to procure technology for a short-term war or conflict. Was China one of the factors that guided this decision, according to you?
That is correct. But if I can just go back to what your little piece said, I think China will be making a big mistake if it thinks that we are not on the same table as them when it comes to military prowess. The biggest advantage the Indian Jawan has, or the Indian forces have, is that we have seen war. China, or the PLA soldier, has not seen war for the last so many decades. So that is one big advantage. Secondly, as Atul had brought out, we are technologically presently, and I feel for the next 10 years, we have an upper edge with respect to our air power and the people on ground. And please do not forget, it is not just the Indian Army. There is the Indian Air Force right behind. And we have got a whole string of air bases now populated with Sukhois. And within 2 years, the Rafales would be coming in, and the first squadron coming up at Hashimara, as the news reports say. The Mountain Strike Corps is being raised at Panagar. and we've got our air assets too. So we are well prepared, and that is what the message I would like to give to your viewers, that though the Chinese certainly have improved tremendously technologically, we have at present and for the next 10 years, I say, an upper hand in terms of war fighting. When it comes to the Navy and our positioning in the Indian Ocean, I think our Andaman and Nicobar Islands are there, and the exercise Malabar, which is taking place, is a little more than an exercise and sending out a tremendous diplomatic message to China in that aspect. That we have friends, and we have friends in Southeast Asia too, and there are various channels that the Indian diplomacy can take.
Right. As we said at the very beginning, this is psychological warfare more than anything else. Atul Aneja, Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur, thank you very much. Appreciate you both joining us this evening on Gravitas and sharing your thoughts with us.